Roll the major announcements. Hallelujah. So let's come together this morning to give in the house of God, being faithful with our tithes and our offerings, beside and honoring God with what He's done, that we would be faithful to give in this place this morning. Let us come together. Let us give as our usher comes forward. Let's bow our heads and our hearts in worship unto God as we pray. Demetrius, if you could bless this offering this morning. Amen. I've got something that the world can't give and the world can't take away. I've got something that the world can't give and it keeps me day by day. I've got something worth talking about. Makes me sing and it makes me shout. I've got something that the world can't take it away. Amen. If you could open your Bibles, the book of Exodus chapter 13. Hallelujah. Sermon titled The Longer Routes. If you've ever paid attention to your GPS, while you're driving, I have in my work truck, I've got one of the screens that are built in so I can be hands-free and all that good fun stuff. But if you've ever paid attention while you're driving along, you'll notice that you'll have your little blue line that's pointing you where you need to go, and then it'll have the gray lines that are off to the side. And attached to it will be a little note. This route is 6 minutes longer. This route is 8 minutes longer. Or sometimes it'll be a couple minutes shorter depending on traffic. There's a crash on your current route. If you go this way, there's a shorter route. Right? And so in this, there are options and times in life in which we can take the shortest route by distance or even seemingly by time, but it's not the safest way. It's not the most effective way or the most efficient way. And nowadays, if you actually break it down on your GPS, you have the fastest way, you have the most eco-friendly way, you have the way that avoids detours, the way that avoids tolls, the way that avoids accidents and disabled vehicles. But just because there is a legitimate way to go does not mean we should take that way. Because sometimes we find partway through, we are forced to take another route. And this morning, I want us to look at God's guidance, His guiding hand, and what seems to be oftentimes the longer route being the best route. Let us look in our text. It's Exodus chapter 13, 17, and 18, and then we will jump into Exodus 14. We've got to jump around a little bit here to make sure that we don't run for 3 hours. Exodus chapter 13, verses 17 and 18. It says, "Then it came to pass, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest perhaps the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. And the children of Israel went up in orderly ranks out of the land of Egypt." Skip down to chapter 14, verses 1 through 4. "Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, that they turn and camp before Pi-hahiroth, and between Migdol and the sea, opposite Baal-zephon. And you shall camp before it by the sea. For Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, They are bewildered by the land, and the wilderness has closed them in. Then I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will pursue them. And I will gain honor over Pharaoh and over all his army, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord." And they did so. Skip down to verse 28 of chapter 14. Then the waters returned and covered the chariots the horsemen and all the army of Pharaoh that came into the sea after him, not so much as one of them remained. But the children of Israel had walked on dry land in the midst of the sea. Waters were a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. So the Lord saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Thus Israel saw the great work which the Lord had done in Egypt. So the people feared the Lord and believed the Lord and his servant Moses. So first we want to take a look at this morning at the God of guidance. God has a desire to lead his people. He has a desire to guide us along the way that we should go. I mentioned the other day, God orders the steps of a righteous man. This is a guiding fact. This is following a spiritual, supernatural GPS. That if you go along with it, you can have nothing that will interfere with what needs to happen. We understand this. Psalms 23, the Lord is my shepherd. A shepherd leads the flock. You cannot drive sheep. You cannot beat them in the direction you want them to go. You have to lead them from the front. And in this, you have to guide them as a whole. And so the flock must choose to follow the shepherd. In our passage in Psalms 23, the psalmist recognizes the nature of God, that God desperately desires to lead us in the way we should go. God guides us because it is who God is in his very nature. And that is what we see in our text in Exodus chapter 13 and verses 17 and 18. It says, again, it came to pass when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest perhaps when the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea. And so in this, we see that God purposely plans a path to get the children out of Israel, out of Egypt, and into the promised land. We see this a little later on in Exodus chapter 13. You look at verses 21. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so as to go by day and night. It has always been the very desire of God to lead us. And in this, we have to consider God is the best guide. I know we all have Siri. We all have Google Maps. But imagine, now remember back a while back, and I don't know how accurate this still is because I don't have Apple products because they're garbage. But in this, remember back in the day when Apple had Apple Maps? And people were driving in like lakes and rivers because Apple Maps was inaccurate. And then you had Google Maps. And Google Maps was like, oh, that was, hey, it wasn't Apple Maps. You weren't driving in the rivers. You weren't driving in the lakes. But then they came out with Waze. And Waze was, for a while there, Waze was legit. Because it would tell you where all the cops were. It would tell you where speed traps, accidents, all that. Now, of course, Google has caught up to that, and Apple Maps has probably caught up to that. But for a while there, you had a variety of different GPS options that you could use, some worse than others. And the reality of it is that we often try to act as if we are the best GPS for our lives. The problem is we can't be when you consider the things of God. See, we have to understand why God is the best guide for our lives. First, it's because he can see what we cannot see. Verse 17 of our text says, lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt. God is capable of seeing outcomes based on the direction that we go. He can see things such as war and or trouble. Think about this. God saved the nation of Israel from facing the Philistines in combat for several hundred years by avoiding a path through the land of the Philistines. And his reason for it is lest when they see war, they change their minds and go back into oppression. See, the other part that God can see beyond just war or trouble is He can see what is inside of us. He can see what we are made of. He can see what we do not know. See, the nation of Israel did not know what war was. But our text says that they went up and left Egypt in battle array. Think about that for a second. They were dressed up for war. They were in ranks and units for war, but they did not know war. It's like watching your children play, growing up we played Marines and terrorists. I'm just saying, I was 13 when the World Trade Center got hit. We had been seeing things already. You go up in Marine Corps town, that's what you do. But in this, all they had of war was their imagination, was the stories of glory that had taken place. God knew that they were unprepared for war. They'd been slaves for 400 years at this point. All they had known was oppression. So it makes it very difficult, even though you're dressed up for war, you can have a sword. If you think about the number of knuckleheads you know that own weapons, and they're the last person that you would want to own a firearm. They literally, the safest place to stand is directly where they're aiming, because they can't hit the target. But they'll tell you very quickly how ready they are to, deal with the bad guy. You're like, yeah, you're a greater threat to all the good people than you are to the bad people. The other thing is God knows what He's going to do with Egypt. Israel does not. See, Exodus 14, verse 4, it says, "Then when I will harden Pharaoh's heart, so that he will pursue them, and I will gain honor over Pharaoh, over all his armies, that the Egyptians may know that I am the Lord." See, God has plans. And so in this, His guide is the best way to be able to see the fulfillment of God's plans. He knows what's in you. He knows what's ahead. And so He says, no. Rather than allow you to go through war, I'm going to allow you to see a military victory, because I'm going to drown all of them. It's going to defeat the military of the nation of Egypt, and you're going to witness the supernatural. I will be glorified. And so in this, we begin to see God has to be the best guide. There is no one else capable of showing, doing, and accomplishing all of these things along the path, along our journey. And how many of us, if we're honest, we would like to see God in His wisdom defeat the enemy for us, while helping us avoid other hardships. So then secondly, we have to look at the concerning paths. The issue with the short path is that it's counterintuitive. See, God in verse 17 says that He takes them on a longer path. But that would seem to be counterintuitive. None of us purposely take the long way to get from point A to point B. We live in a generation in which we try to be as quick as possible with everything we do. It was just announced, I believe it was Delta Airlines just purchased a bunch of supersonic commercial aircraft so that people can fly from New York to London in 3.5 hours, because we have to get there faster. Everything has to be faster. That's why we have the GPS. Our GPS is programmed to take us on the shortest possible path at all times. And so because of this, it is counterintuitive for us to take a longer route. And this is what God did. He purposely took them on the longer route. And we have to question, would we be willing to take a longer route in life? And of course we would like, well, of course I would. If that meant I got there safely, I would take the longer route. Would you take the longer route if you didn't know what the difference was? The children of Israel didn't know what the difference was. God did not say, I'm taking you the long way because you might run into the Philistines. God said, I won't take them that way because they might run into the Philistines and they might turn around. It never says that He told the nation of Israel His reasoning why. It was counterintuitive and it required faith. Secondly, it was a wilderness. which is a vulnerable path, a wilderness. There's not much in the way of food in the wilderness. There's not much in the way of shelter in the wilderness. There's not much in the way of protection in the wilderness. It left them vulnerable because if you actually study out what ended up happening, they crossed between two mountains. There was a mountain range on the left and a mountain range on the right. They were in the valley, and in front of them was the sea. So they're in the wilderness and they're trapped. There's nowhere to go. And Pharaoh's army is coming behind them. So this would also appear to be a poor military decision. Remember what I just mentioned. They were all dressed up for war. The first thing they do is walk face first into a trap. But God had planned it out. This is the unexpected path. They were dressed for battle, but God wasn't taking them that direction. They were dressed for battle, but they would have been better off with their swim trunks and flippy floppies. Are you willing to take the route that would leave you vulnerable? Because we live in a day and age in which we have to keep our walls up at all times, in which we have to keep our defenses up at all times. No one can get too close. No one can get close enough to hurt us. But God led them directly to a place where it would seem as if they were going to either drown or be slaughtered, with no hope for escape. Those are the only two options. Mountains on the left, mountains on the right. Only thing in front of us is an ocean or a sea, the Red Sea. The only thing behind us is a group of guys that want to kill us all. We don't like that. We don't like that feeling. And of course, this would be quite a concern on the direction that we're going. But this was a strategic path. See, God isn't just concerned with getting us to our destination. God was orchestrating something greater inside them. To quote Pastor Greg, God is like really, really smart. And that's the part that we so often fail to understand. See, God knew exactly what was in the children of Israel, and that they would want to return if they encountered war, that a fight would actually hurt them, even if they won the battle, that they would retreat back into a place that they had just left, back into the oppression that they had begged for 400 years to be released from. And so God was protecting them from a greater threat than Pharaoh's army. God was protecting them from their own fear. And you consider this, that Egypt at the time was the world's most powerful empire. They had the world's most powerful military. And God said that, no, the biggest threat isn't the most powerful military in the world. The biggest threat is your own fear. That you would go back and willingly subject yourself to that same empire. And so they are dressed for battle. They are unprepared for it. And God says, no, I'm going to lead you this direction. I'm going to take you the way you should go. This is strategic. With one fell swoop, God was able to set his people free and to destroy the most powerful army in the world, releasing them from their oppression. Because ultimately, the longer route was the best route. See, God knows what's best. The longer route was the correct route for the nation of Israel. And so the lesson here that we have to understand is that God knows what's best for us. Verse 17, God says, lest perhaps when the people change their minds. This is the issue. God knows what's best. So he made a way to help us avoid changing our mind. To help us avoid making a mistake. And in this, I don't know if you've ever studied it out. I think I've preached on it here, but I might be wrong. If you actually study it out, the book of Deuteronomy, they took their path from about a 7 or 8 day trip to an 11-day trip. Because if you look at it from Mount Sinai to the border of the River Jordan, was an 11-day journey. It wasn't like, oh, we could have been there in 24 hours. No, it was still going to be about a week-long journey. God added 3 days so that you wouldn't all be killed by the Philistines and then run back into slavery. Is 3 days really worth losing his destiny over? That's the difference. And yes, we know the children of Israel wandered in the wilderness for 40 days. But they were always within an 11-day walk of entering the promised land. They just refused to. What you see is God preventing them from doing what they would do eventually when they heard about the giants in the land. They spied out the land for 40 days. God knew what was in them, so He protected them from going back to Egypt. But if you study it out, and you see they scout out the land for 40 days, and they come back, 10 with bad reports, 2 with good reports, and they say, let us elect a new leader and go back to Egypt. God knew what was in them before they ever had a chance to express it. And you see it all this time later, guess what? They still have that in them. And so, if we were to surrender unto God, it might be a longer route, but it's still the best one. Nation of Israel wandered 40 years in the wilderness. That does not include the months in which they, because we know Moses was on the mountain for 40 days and for 40 nights. That's when they started to worship the golden calves and everything else. And then there was the establishment of the Levitical law. So you're looking at probably close to 90 days when all was said and done, before they began their journey, the 11 days from Mount Sinai to the River Jordan. Then they got there. They scouted out the land for another 40 days. And then they wandered for 40 years. God took them the longer route. They could have been there in 390 years after Jacob brought his 76 people down to the land of Egypt. But instead, it was 430 years because they refused to take the longer route. Could you imagine waiting 40 years to get the thing that you've already been promised because you decided not to follow through? Like if you draw this in comparison, there's giants there. There's also bushels of grapes so big that it requires 2 grown men to carry it. There's land flowing with milk and honey. We just watched God drown the most powerful army in the world, like 3 months ago. But now we're going to back off. See, God has power to do beyond what we can see, and beyond what we can do on our own. This story shows God's power over Egypt. This story shows God's power over all the things of this world. Verse 29, so the children of Israel walked on dry ground. This is a supernatural dynamic. This is a miracle. How many of us experience miracles on the daily? How many of us, we allow ourselves to take the longer route and follow God and experience daily miracles? Because let's not forget, they experienced the pillar of cloud, they experienced the pillar of fire, and they experienced manna. Every day was a miracle. And when they got tired of the manna, they got quail. Imagine that. They didn't have to hunt for it. They just popped up. Hey, cook that one right there. Every day there was a supernatural element. Verse 30, the Lord saved Israel over the Egyptians. God deals with their greatest enemy in that moment. Who can use supernatural, miraculous power every day, and for God to deal with your greatest enemy? Oh, but that's the long way. But it's the best way. I would make this comparison. It's the difference between cooking your food and microwaving your food. You can eat, but microwave food tastes like someone washed their feet in it. Or you can take the long way, properly season, prepare, marinate, do whatever you got to do, put it in an oven, take the longer way, and that thing comes out delicious, doesn't it? Which would you rather have? Everybody here, I would rather have the long way as long as I didn't have to prepare it. Lastly, we learn who God is. Verse 31, Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against Egypt, so that the people feared the Lord. They were in awe of God. They learned to surrender and obey. First, they believed in the Lord. Now they have a confidence in God that they can trust Him. They also believed the servant Moses. There was confidence in the man of God. And maybe you're on what feels like a longer route with God. But this story teaches us that God knows what is best, so we can trust it, and that we can obey it, and that we can step into something greater. Because we can talk about the nation of Israel, but you know who was truly blessed during all this time? There were two men, Joshua and Caleb. And even though they had to take the even longer route of 40 years, waiting for everyone else to die off, they were blessed. They crossed over. Caleb inherited an entire mountain with valleys and vineyards and took over an entire city. Here, Jericho. His inheritance was so large, he was able to give away parts of it to his daughter and to his son-in-law, where they could have springs and be able to grow their own stuff naturally. Because they were willing to take the longer route. You know, God, we trust you. So this morning, as we close, the challenge is placing their faith in God, even on the longer road. Because we are a microwave generation. We sound like that J.G. Wentworth commercial. I want my money and I want it now. You even sing the song. So as I mentioned J.G. Wentworth, yeah, I know it. That's the type of generation. But God knows the best. Can we place our faith in God? Lord, order my steps, that I will follow, that I will be blessed. Can we allow God to take us on the longer route? Let's bow our heads this morning. All of salvation is technically the longer route, because we gain true inheritance, true blessing on the other side of eternity. Everyone wants to live their best life now, but that is not true destiny. God takes us along the route to avoid pitfalls, to avoid destruction, to avoid the things of this world that will destroy us or send us back into our oppression. And while there can be blessing, while there can be inheritance on the side of eternity, the long route is the path to heaven. And God wants to help us along the way. He wants to show you His power. He wants to lead you. He wants to show you His very nature, that you will be able to receive all of the promises. And so this morning, you're here in your house of God. And you look, you see only the destruction. You see only the damage, the scars of war from the path that you've tried to take. So you know what? I want that supernatural intervention. I want that blessing, that grace. I want the promised inheritance of God. That would require conversion. That would require salvation, changing of the mind and the heart.